interest for anything that's Greek in this country, and I always feel an obligation, together with my Greek colleagues, to talk about our country because of the interest. And this is a joint effort. I mean, I'm speaking my capacity as the director of the Center for International European Studies here at the CIES University. But, you know, when I was thinking that we need to do something, the first person I called was Professor Vangelis from Boğaziçi University, and I said, Vangeli, we need to do something about this. And then we made this into a joint event together with the Greek History and Culture Study Group at Boğaziçi University that Vangelis is a part of. And actually we had previously done something under the aegis of Boğaziçi University for the 2012 elections. And that's why I thought of contacting Vangelis. And what I would like to say is, you know, here we are, 4 Greek colleagues. Ayana Feredinu from Bilgi University, a well-known journalist, knows this country well and Greece well as well. Vangelis has been here, how many years have you been here? 15 years. My colleague Kostas Ifandis, who is more of the newcomer here, even though it's already been 3 years. 3 years. And what we, you know, when I called Vangelis was because I know that Vangelis and I, at least on political issues in Greece, have different perspectives. I think, you know, this is our duty to sort of highlight our differences as well as we talk about this topic in particular. And so I hope somehow that these are not party perspectives. I think these are more intellectual differences. And I think it was our duty to sort of come up with a panel that would somehow highlight this. This is what I want to say by way of introduction, but maybe Vangelis, since both of us are co-chairing, you would like to say something as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank Dimitri for the invitation. Indeed, 2.5 years ago, we had a similar panel after the elections back then. And that was an interesting discussion we had. Let me start by saying that indeed the fact that there are a few of us Greek nationals who work in Turkish universities or for Turkish newspapers, it is our duty, as Dimitri said, but also it is our right to be involved not only into debates that are now currently taking place in Greece, as each one of us has also his own or her own sympathies and networks and way of expressing ourselves back there, but also here. There has been a fascination with the Greek election results among various parts of the Turkish society. And we think the need to be part of this debate, the fascination, or the whatever criticism, skepticism might this trigger. Therefore, here we are to debate, share our views, our disagreements, our common points, but also invite you to not only to be informed, but to inform us also about how the Turkish public responds and how we could contribute to the debate here as well. 2.5 years ago, I had made a prediction, which has come half true. I had said back then, Dimitri, that this coalition government will last for a year, which, as it is, as a coalition, it did last. But the government as such, with 2 of the partners, around until recently, as you know. So, yes, so I will avoid any predictions. That's what I promised to do today, because they can be embarrassing. And I will discuss issues that are closer to my expertise, which is history. I'm an Ottoman historian. I'm not a specialist on European issues or international relations, so I feel safer in areas that might be or might not be related to what we discussed today. I would like to thank our colleagues for accepting the invitation, and again, give the floor back to Dimitri. Start? Yeah, of course. Okay. So we have agreed among ourselves not to use more than 10 minutes. I've already used 4 or 5, I think that was
With disregard to
election. So as I said, let me make a few points regarding the prehistory of these elections and this victory. For whatever they deserve, they might be worthy of. Whether one is happy with the result or not, the truth remains that this is the first time that we have a leftist government in this country. And this is the time that we have a leftist government in Europe, one could say, but that would be partly true. Recently, for different reasons, historians or other scholars have been trapped, as it happens so frequently, to a game of historical comparisons. For instance, it was argued that these elections might remind us eventually of the disaster of 1920, 1922, when at the point when the Greek society, Greek state, Greek government was victorious, was coming victorious after the First World War, that is the Venizelos liberal government. This was replaced after an unfortunate result of the November 1920 elections. The government power was taken over by right-wing or rather royalist, I should say, party, which was more populist. They will return to this term. And this led to the disaster of 1922. That was a serious argument made by historians. I'm not going now to discuss whether this makes any sense or not. I find it very problematic. I'm just presenting instances, just to give you an idea about how history plays a role in this debate. Another comparison that has been made even more recently is that this coalition government, or this leftist experience, might be compared to the Front Populair's government experience of 1936. I remind you that that was a period that, after the very disaster of the depression of 1929, and then a long period of recession, left and right radical movements had appeared, and this led in France eventually to a coalition between socialists and communists. That's why I'm saying it's not exactly true that this is the first time that a leftist government has come to power in Europe, because there is a previous example of 1936. There are similarities, there are differences apart. I'm not going to discuss this as well. There is one point that I find here interesting to stress, though, which is that, okay, this experiment lasted for 2 years, until 1938, and then 1940 France collapsed in the Second World War. But it left a tradition, it left a heritage. The whole decade of the 30s left a heritage with respect to labor rights, with respect to social security, with respect to democracy in general, that is going to be taken over after the Second World War. What is going to happen now, I won't be that there is a point that brings us at least close to that experience with respect to the energy, the negative energy that has been unleashed at a time when there are arguments made now by this government already, but also others in Europe, saying that if this fails, and that's in terms of addressing the European Union institutions, if this fails, then you will have to deal with the extreme right. And this actually is what happened in the interwar period. So we are at a fragile, very fragile ground. What lessons? I'm not going to discuss any lessons from the past. I'm just reflecting my own concerns. I was glad myself, that's my personal insight with the results. What I was not happy at all was the coalition with the right-wing nationalist conservative party. There are reasons, there are arguments and counter-arguments. As a citizen, I was glad to see that government was put together on the very first day. So as a citizen, I was glad to see that, because you remember what happened in the previous elections, that we needed to have a second one that was dragging for 4 months. But as someone who believes in a certain spectrum, I'm not happy at all with this coalition. Yet, there has been a discussion, a debate, as I've been following articles, accounts during the last months, a very interesting narrative that tries to deconstruct the traditional division between left and right. And of course, as we know, after the 90s and the fall of communism, these older divisions have been challenged. But now actually what we don't realize is that we are not in the post-socialist era, we are in the post-post-socialist era. So the post-socialist era as such, I don't think, and the arguments and the tools that were relevant to that era before, that lasted at least I think until 2008, when the crisis came in order to lead us to the need to come up with new tools, should make us think about what this post-post era looks like. And one of the things that I find particularly problematic is the use of terms which derive directly from the 19th century and refer particularly to terms and ideologies such as liberalism and populism. So there is an attempt to describe, to replace this old right-wing division with a new division between populist and liberal parties or political forces, within which, of course, now we have a very different mapping of political parties, according to which, for instance, a leftist populist party, such as CIES, if we accept that it is a populist party, and a right-wing populist party, such as the Golden Dawn, if we accept that this is only a populist party, actually can fit into the same category. Now, this kind of technological and conceptual sliding has actually two problems, and both of them, I'm sorry to say, are related to the historical background of this discussion. One is the fact that when these ideologies, liberalism and populism, appeared back in the 19th century, of course liberalism is much older, but at least until, let's say, the interwar period, we don't yet have socialism and communism taking over and building upon, in certain cases, both of them, and determining how political rivalries will develop within the 20th century. So when today we make this kind of distinction and we just totally rule out any possibility of addressing the historical roots of what today is a left-wing or a right-wing party, grouping a left-wing European, because let me remind you that this particular party, CIES, has its origins in the split of 1968, when several communist parties in Europe experienced this crisis of whether they should remain loyal to Soviet Union because, as a result of the Prague invasion or not. So this kind of ideological roots, if disregarded, of course it is easy to group Syriza together with the Golden Dawn. But I think that we should pay more tribute to history than that. The other point is that there is slightly in terms of the way that the terms are used in terms of their semiotics, not in terms of their meaning. And what I mean is that no one today would accept being labeled as a populist. I mean, I don't see, at least in Greece, anyone saying, I'm a populist party, I'm a member of a populist party, I'm a populist myself. Whereas many would accept being labeled as liberals. I'm a liberal person, or I belong to a liberal party. That was not the case back in the 19th century when these terms appeared. There were people who would describe themselves as liberals, and of course in Greece we have a similar case, which is the Liberal Party, Φιλελεύθεροι, the zealots of the beginning of the 20th century, and there were others who were populist because that was how the term described an ideology when it appeared with the Narodnik movement in Russia. So the Narodnik movement is a populist movement, both literally and symbolically. This literal use of the term has disappeared. So very conveniently, we make this jump into today's politics, disregarding all this background, and we make this equation that is very confusing and does not allow us to address the differences, the possibilities for the domestic politics in Greece, for European politics. As I said, I'm not a specialist on European politics, so I won't delve into that. That's the territory of my friends. One last thing about reforms. Do I have? No, actually, it's over. The reforms, which is a major catchword, and it has been so for several decades. Of course, now it has appeared reforms through a particular European perspective of how to organize states, bureaucracy, what is the relation between the individual and the state, what are the relations between different states. It has appeared as somehow an agenda or force from above. So reforms will be implemented no matter what. That was not always the case. Reforms, structural reforms, again back in the interwar period, was a response to National Socialism, to communism, to liberal capitalism. And that was the attempt of political forces to find a solution to what was really crucial in similar conditions of crisis, which is what? How to galvanize a national economy. Of course, then it was not in conditions of globalization as it is today, but the very notion of national economy appeared back then. Do we discuss now this issue in similar terms? Do we refer us all to the notion of a national economy within an international environment? As I said, okay, I'm not the expert, so I'm just bringing this as a question. I think that will be enough for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I'll go next, then I'll give the floor to Ariana, and then Kostas. I listened very carefully to Vangelis's comments. I mean, he also made a veiled reference to an article I wrote recently in Bulgarian Daily News about classification, but with regard to populism. But it's nice to go and through a historical explanation as to where terms stand or don't stand. But there is a reality, and the reality is that I come from a country, just like Vangelis, just like everyone in this panel, and many of you in this room, that is on the verge of bankruptcy if it's not bankrupt. And so these are not necessarily normal times. These are not normal times. And this government, which, by the way, has barely taken office a week ago, has not even been able to present its program in Parliament. We'll be doing this, I think, over the weekend, has been trying to deal with this in a language that supposedly is different than what its predecessors were. But we've heard many things about Syriza and Syriza's victory. And it's interesting, the reactions it has elicited here in Turkey and elsewhere. Does it signify, the winds of change? I say no. If you look at the numbers, and the numbers are also important, Syriza got 1 vote out of 3 that actually voted. And one has to keep in mind the fact that 34% of Greeks did not vote. And these numbers did not necessarily change from previous elections. Syriza did not bring in new voters. So this is the reality. It's not any different than any other victory. As opposed, now there is a big debate about whether it's a left party, what it claims, or it's a populist party. I would tend to claim that it is a populist party, and it has managed to come through on that platform by promising many things to everybody who's disenchanted with the fact that reforms have not necessarily bettered one's standard of living as one would have expected. But I also say that Syriza is a status quo party. It's not any different than the parties that were governing us before Syriza's election. It's not any different than the 2 big parties that came to power with the fall of democracy in 1974, New Democracy and PASOK. that actually, where the two parties have cultivated the big state, the big fat state. And the big fat state has crumbled, and because of it we're in crisis. And it's vested interests. And if one looks and one does an analysis of who voted for Syriza, one sees a direct correlation between the crumbling of PASOK, which is par excellence a statist party, and basically it's everybody who feels that they have a vested interest, public employees, nothing wrong with being a public employee, but having a vested interest in the fact that the state has to decline in order for the economy to take off, and therefore would want Syriza to preserve it, and that's where a lot of the voters have come from. Likewise, the gradual diminution of New Democracy's numbers is also reflected by that, even though New Democracy managed to retain the numbers was only 2% down from the last elections. This is a reality. Syriza also got voters from a new segment of the population, which is the unemployed. Greece is a country with over 25% unemployment and over 50% youth unemployment. And if one looks at the numbers, 45% of the unemployed vote for Syriza, in the hope that Syriza might be something new, or in a message to the old guard, you know, we want the system to die, let the new system be born, whatever that means. So, and when I say a status party, it's not a status quo party, it's not any different. One can also see by, as we started having information about who's filling in and which individuals are filling in all the new positions, the state positions, the state administration. It's all PASOK people that were part of the state. And this is a reality also. So, Syriza, a new hope, yes, it's different. One would never have expected, I don't think, Syriza and Tsipras would have expected a party of 4% a few years ago could climb to where it is today, running a country. But it is a mismatch. It is made up, it's a party made up of ideologues that are 4%, real, virtuous, leftist thinkers that still believe the world should be run in that sense. And there's nothing wrong with that. And the reality that it's a party that came to power under times of crisis, not normalcy. Times of crisis, where we do not know if salaries or pensions or anything else is going to be provided at the end of next month. And I'll get to this in a second. And so it represents all these various interests. Now, how the Prime Minister, Alexis Tsipras, will be able to bring this together and run a country, we shall see. So far, actually even before the campaign, Tsipras has shown that he's been trying to act as a Prime Minister. And he has tempered his language, and I think as Prime Minister too, he realizes he's not the leader of Syriza only, he's the leader of all Greeks. But he still has to make do with the coalition that supports him, whether in the party and, or outside the party. So that's the first thing. And you know, as to the fact that we hear a lot of references and hope that, you know, democracy and so on, I mean, every fair and free election is a democratic is democracy. And Greece, at least for a long time, since '74, has had by and large fair and free elections. So we should say this. I talked about Syriza being the deep state. I mean, deep state, as I said, because of the vested interest, just like PASOK is a deep state for me, just like New Democracy represents a deep state. So it's not any different than that. Now, the problem, and this is where the clue, the key rests. We are talking about a country which is not a normal country by any means because of the crisis. We are talking about an electorate which feels it's being boxed every day. It's down in its last rope. Whether you are in the private sector, which is where the core of unemployed come from, or whether you are in the public sector where you still have your job, but your salaries have been cut. You just feel punched. You feel like there's no hope. And even though there might have been, and there are some macroeconomic indicators that things are improving, they're not necessarily reflected on the ground. And so we are talking about a country that feels marginalized. We are talking about a country that feels punched. That feels that it does not know how to move ahead, get over its crisis. And when you feel like this, populism comes in. Populism sells. And this has nothing to do with being on the right or the left. It's very simple. Everyone is beating up on us. We need to stand up and fight. We, the proud Greeks. And while we're doing this, we forget that the reason we are in this mess is not necessarily because of our creditors, but because we let our big state become even bigger and productive. So a degree of mea culpa, which has to occur, is not necessarily occurring. And as long as it does not occur, Greece will feel even more marginalized. And this is the real danger. It's a danger with the Syriza government because it's the government. But because it has used a lot of populist language and symbols, making promises that will bring back jobs, it will deal with issues, it will bring back benefits that were cut in order to deal with the crisis. One can say, well, it's a different approach. Yes, but there is no money. So it will have to address this. And for all the bluster that we have in the last month, in the last week, it's a two-azimuth sort of policy. Let's go out and negotiate in the open and throw out things. And just because Syriza's platform has been, we will not seek the last tranche of our, what the creditors are supposed to give us, 7.2 billion, which are necessary to fill our coffers, to pay our salaries and pensions and so on, because there are conditions attached to it, which the country is liable to. It's not the parties that ruled before. These are conditions, there's continuity in the state. Now we have the new thing, well, okay, let's go to the ECB and ask for treasury bonds and bills that finance our banks, 10 billion worth, so that the economy will not crumble. All I'm saying is that there's a change in rhetoric, there's a change in attitude. Everyone is fascinated by rockstar finance ministers and no-tie wearing politicians, which is fine. It's nice, it's different, it's refreshing, but the substance does not change about where the country is in. And this is the reality of what Greece faces. It would have been the reality also, less so, had new democracy won, because new democracy would have continued more or less within the program that has been set in place, even though it does not alleviate for many of the ills. So we have to, and the concern is that this country that's marginalized and might further marginalize itself. And the marginalization of the marginalized, for me, is a dangerous thing, because it starts putting into question everything that the country stands for. It starts putting into question, and by the way, Syriza, much in its platform, is very much like PASOK in its platform in 1980s, anti-NATO, even though they try to hide it now, or even anti-EU at times, because there's always a thing, whether we need the Europeans or not. But I do hope they will realize that they cannot be anti-NATO, anti-EU. But as you marginalize yourself, because ultimately your creditors and your debtors might say, you're out on your own, and whatever implications those are, means going to a new drachma or whatever else you go to, then you will start talking tough, because you have to create the discourse that we are standing alone against the world. Who are we? A country of 10.5 million, 0.3% of the global population, 1.9% of the EU's population, 0.30% of the global GDP, which it's only 0.30% because we are a member of the EU. Imagine what it would be if we were outside. And we will stand firmly against the world. Well, this is where the populist danger comes in. And this is where parties on the right or parties on the left have used. And of course, it's not necessarily a Greek phenomenon, but it is a particular Greek phenomenon right now, because we have a party that thinks differently that's come to power. So this is what I would like to say. I have many more things to say, but I'm just saying that let's be clear about what we're talking about. Ultimately, the Greek voter, whether the one who voted for Syriza or the one that did not, is still wondering about the immediate fate of the economy and his paycheck and his bank account, which is zero, predominantly, and how he wants to deal with this. And these are the realities of Greece, as opposed more to the ideological discourses. Ariadne.
Well, I think, yes, okay. Yeah. I was in a difficult position because my friend Vangelis made a very accurate and very descriptive introduction to the historical perspective of what's happening here in this. Mr. Triantafylou, whom I remember 2 years ago, he was going around saying that I'm an undecided voter. I think now you are very decided.
I don't vote for I don't vote for PASOK, and I don't vote for Syriza.
Yeah. Well, I remember it was very, very strong because
Yes.
I don't know whom shall I vote for, but from what you said, I think it's quite clear what you were going to vote for. I think after listening to all that, I think I will talk about more personal things. I'm a journalist as well as an academic teacher. And the reason why I will put forward my personal issues, not because of anything else, but it is an indication of how things have been in Greece, at least for the last 2 years. Some of you may, actually, to be exact, on the June 10th of 2014, the government of the coalition party, PASOK and New Democracy, the major coalition, but Brazil and Democratic Left, a leftist party, decided to shut down the national broadcaster, something like shutting down TRT here. Okay, this was an... Actually, the same reaction I got when I said that I am the correspondent of TRT and they closed my employer down. Is that I wish they had done that to people here. Yeah. What makes it was that it was, if you like, an accumulation of acts by the then coalition government, which challenged what we perceive as our democratic rights for broadcasting as journalists, of receiving certain information. We as journalists, as workers of this sector, and especially me, I am a correspondent of this national broadcaster. I have been for more than 15 years. Then I found myself completely out of job, without any reason, just because the government needed to cut down around 3,000 people from the public sector. So in one day, and actually the day that the government decided to close down the public broadcaster was the day that Gezi events were taking place here. I was in Taksim Square, I was covering those events. Suddenly everything went blank and black. This traumatic experience, which was an affront to democratic rights of everybody, plus mine as a professional, I don't think anybody can forget. Still, the way the government decided to stop any kind of public information, information from a public broadcaster, still, they say, is something that people, was one of the reasons why a lot of people who are undecided have voted against New Democracy. I want to say that the issue is not so economical. Why Greeks have suddenly felt a sort of new energy sweeping around the society is not so economical. It's the frustration of a lack of democracy in the public state, in the public administration. The last government was governed not by actually the parliament. It was governed by a group, a camarilla around the Prime Minister and the junior coalition party, the leader of it. The Prime Minister was hardly appearing in the Parliament, if at all. The decisions were taken by him and his entourage, and the ministers were just informed what they were supposed to do. So I think a major issue that brought the voters to the ballot boxes and voted for Syriza, among other things, was the frustration about the autocratic and undemocratic rule of the last government. They just reached to a point where they couldn't take it any longer. I have lots and lots and lots of cases. My colleagues, 3,000 of my colleagues in RNT are out of work. In 1.5 years, several people died, several people committed suicide, several people lost their houses. So we cannot only talk about numbers. Of course, we know the situation. People know the situation. In a last poll, Syriza, opinion poll, Syriza is being backed by about 70% of the public opinion. So the energy is there. The frustration is there. The frustration about seeing their democratic rights being attacked and destroyed. The need for proper information. Everybody is aware that something is changing. Okay, we know we are 10 million, less than 10 million. But somehow we see that even at this particular point and on this particular historical juncture, perhaps Greece might be a starting point of a new thinking about Europe, about European structure, about Eurozone. It's not because we are important, but because we found ourselves at that particular moment and at that particular crisis. So I am not so pessimistic. I don't like to look at figures so strictly. I think there is something more than figures at this particular moment. Just reminding you, of course, that President Obama suddenly, out of the blue, decided to make a statement saying we think that people should not squeeze out societies in order to get austerity measures applied. So I am neither pessimistic nor too optimistic, but I think there is a new energy around in the country, in the society, and I think at this particular junction, as I say, maybe we may see some change of mood in Europe. And don't forget, there are more elections coming. In a few months, we will have elections in Spain, and more are coming later. So a new thinking which tends to people want to bring back Europe to its foundation principles of democratic rights and freedom. Maybe there is there, and maybe people will be rethinking about that.
Okay, thank you very much. Kostas Fandis. Kostas Katiorgas, University of Athens.
Thank you very much. Well, so many things to discuss. First of all, I thought of wearing a necktie, but given that my students here and my colleagues know that I very rarely wear a necktie, that would have been too much of a political statement, so I thought what I have. Let me say that, there are, although it's very early, and history, even in, political science, comparative politics, they need, you need some time, you need to distance yourself from what has been happening in order to write, explain, interpret, and write an academic paper. But what I've been thinking is that there are two explanations of what happened in Greece. The first one is, let's say, a conventional explanation. The other is less conventional, but it's not on the fringes. So the conventional explanation is that until 2010, Syriza was a small fringe party on the far left, or the radical left, or whatever you want to label it. And then you have, within 4 years, its transformation into an electoral powerhouse. So the explanation is that this was a reaction to the outcome, the political outcome of the devastating effects of the economic depression that has racked Greece for about 7 years now, 6 years now. Okay? And we know the numbers, and for me, numbers are very important, and I have to graciously disagree with Ariane. If you don't have numbers that prosper, people would never prosper. were poor or were not as well as you would have expected. There is an undeniable truth. If numbers do not prosper, then people cannot prosper by any. So there are no magic formulas. Whether these are in classical economics or they are, radical left political economy or whatever. So for me, and this is a starting point, numbers are important. Otherwise, we are in fantasy world. So since 2007, what happened? Greece lost 1/4 of its GDP, and its unemployment rate has surpassed 25%. It was 28, now it's 25 plus, but still is stuttering. And it's not so much the social effect of this, is the fact that it happened overnight. 2010, crisis started 2009. 2010, unemployment was 8%. We didn't have yet a clear view of the GDP reduction. So within 4 years, less than 4 years, imagine a country. So, and this is the conventional explanation that, in other words, it was natural for Greek electorate to turn toward a party that is promised them a different economic recipe than the one imposed on Greece by the Troika. And what Syriza promised, it has promised to do away with austerity. It has promised to eliminate, but to keep balanced budgets. It has promised to take back all the reforms, because these reforms are market-oriented reforms, and of course we have something there. But let's go back. Why did we had all this? Because Greece had reckless economic policies in the past. Economic policies that caused it to overborrow, and subsequently the country lost its ability to finance a huge debt. Now there is a parallel between Syriza and PASOK's advent to power in 1981, and I think there are many great many similarities, but there are also differences as well. At that point, PASOK got an economy with 26% of debt to GDP, and in 1989-90, when PASOK lost the elections, the debt GDP ratio was something like below 100%. So there was a very big fiscal expansion, but the fundamentals of the Greek economy at that time were much more sound than they are today. So the previous governments, what they had to do was to cut spending and raise revenues. And that's, of course, is a combination within a global financial crisis that is certain to cause widespread economic pain. And certainly did not fill our self-esteem that bitter, lethal medicine was administered from abroad. For me, this is the key to the second explanation. Vangelis talked about populism, and of course his historical account is sound, it's excellent. But there is another literature on populism, which is post-1960s, 70s, and mainly it's left-wing literature. Ernesto Laclau, for those who are familiar with neo-Marxist sociology, economics and politics. I think we should sort of locate Greek populism within that, analysis, which says that mainly populism in Greece came as a result of the political practice of PASOK, political practice that was concretized by Andreas Papandreou in the 1980s. For those who have even an elementary familiarization with Greek politics in the 80s, Papandreou's rhetoric combined elements as diverse as the legacy of old, prominent, anti-royal, centrist politicians like the third Venizelos, of course, and like his father, George Papandreou, and combine those with the discourse that became very, let's say, hegemonic, and its roots can be found to the communist-led partisan movements during the Second World War and later in the Civil War. So, and on top of that, you have to add this idea, this perception in Greece that of the commitment of a linear continuity of Hellenism and the cultural values, of course, of Christian Orthodoxy. And you take left-wing discourse, which at that time was very Stalinist, of course, and you combine it with very, very traditional nationalistic discourses, and you get someone very dominant, so hegemonic like Andreas Papandreou in the 80s. And of course, for him it was very easy to castigate EU and NATO, as Dimitris said, without any consequences. Of course, it was the context of the Cold War, so Greece was allowed to use this rhetoric, but in reality, we didn't move an inch from the Western. At the same time, in the post-70s or post-60s, like Vangelis indicated, what we had was, or let's say in the 80s, what the left did. The left, and this is a prelude to what we have today, the left, although initially they dismissed PASOK's populism, but they dismissed it as a project with the aim to deceive the Greek proletariat and sort of distance it from class consciousness. And of course, this project failed. The Orthodox Communist Party always was below 10–8%, and the Reformist Communist Party was in and out of parliament. But the result was that the left, at the end, in the 90s, had to adjust itself, had to abandon proletarian internationalism as a mobilization means, and especially, after 95 and the advent in PASOK of Kostas Simitis, and it had to realign itself. So you started seeing, since the mid-90s and the advent, I repeat, of Kostas Simitis, with a different discourse, much more European mainstream political discourse. You had the left, the reaction of the left was to incorporate, to accept sort of the promotion of national values and national idiosyncrasies as a vehicle to maintain, sort of a collective solidarity in the light of the threat posed by global capitalism and globalization. So what you had in the 90s and the 80s, in the good times in terms of the economic progress, you had an osmosis that the left incorporated selected elements of traditional nationalism from the right and the center, whereas the right sort of adopted certain aspects of the left's anti-imperialist, anti-American genre. That's why you had the parties on the right that are so anti-imperial in the rhetoric, like Golden Dawn or Laos in the past, or all the spin-off sort of parties from New Democracy. So since the 90s, and I think this is important, but we don't have to discuss it, we had Greek national populism or ethno-populism, as I like to call it, which is, it has taken the dimensions of a mass phenomenon. And it has been evolving along 4 premises. One is a brand of underdog nationalism, which was always there in Greece, but now became much more partisan in its outlook. The second one is a profound anti-intellectualism. The third premise is, of course, anti-Western sentiments, which often are more political than, more cultural than political. And fourth, a subtle sort of disposition towards authoritarianism. And this, of course, although people don't like it, but it's true if you see the electoral performance of parties like Golden Dawn or other sort of authoritarian parties. I think I'll stop here and we'll come back to it. Thank you.
All right, now we'll move on to our guest star, who is going to tell us what actually happened. What we can
Thank you very much, Dimitri, for inviting me. I think I'm here because I love Greece and I consider it as a kind of a second home, so I'm very happy to be here. And I apologize for being late. Whenever a phenomenon like Syriza happens, you know, whenever a political something happens that challenges the neoliberal orthodoxy, there is a neoliberal, neoconservative self within me that suddenly reacts to it and tells me that they are not going to be successful. We shouldn't challenge this neoliberal orthodoxy. It is the word of God, and it should stay, you know, here. And that tells me how much I am overtaken by the neoliberal hegemony. My brain is full of it. We are, since the late 1980s at least, since the early 1980s, we are all taught to celebrate and worship a person called the businessman. And we should open the gates wide for him so that he travels freely and finds money, raises funds and invests and creates jobs for all of us. All we have to do is to lift the barriers for him, is to cleanse the path for this person. And the businessman, like the chevalier of the Middle Ages, he became the hero of contemporary times. We should all follow him, we should all worship him, and all we have to do is to sort of cleanse the path for him, and he will do the job. He would travel to China, he would travel to Malaysia, and we should create obviously nice airports for him so that he should relax. We should also create business class sections in the airports, and he should eat his good food, and he should have more leg space for him. He should earn 1,000 times more wages than us, for example, academics, because he is much more important than us. You know, so for almost like a quarter of a century, the neoliberals, the neoconservatives in my mind, has taught me that you should worship that person, and no matter what he does, you know, you should continue to follow him because he is the caballero, the chevalier of your times. He is gonna save you, and you should also forgive him when he makes little mistakes. I think so. When Syriza came to power, this neoliberal instinct of mine told me they are gonna fail, and they are going to turn into PASOK in no time, like this old-style populism. Who are they? You know, some academics, radical lefty guys from Athens that I was meeting in the early 2000s. We were having nice chats in the tavernas, and so they can't govern Greece. We need a neoliberal guy, a serious person who wouldn't say no to Merkel. Then I would trust, and the Athens Borsa would rise. And then the more I think about it, the more this neoliberal instinct of mine dominates me. And I start to hate Syriza. And I want the right-wing parties come back and take over so that we should all relax. The radical left is 6%, the right-wing parties are 46%, and we should sleep comfortably nowadays. But the reality, obviously, that Syriza came to power. So that obviously, I was trying to sort of really defeat the neoliberal, self in me, which is constantly sort of calling me to realism, economic realism. And when I was trying to think about Syriza, I was really struggling with this instinct of mine. And when I was struggling with this instinct of mine, I came up with a few points that I wanted to share with you, some psychological, some social scientific points. One is that the moment I heard Syriza's victory, I thought about Bülent Ecevit's victory in 1977, in June 1977 in Turkey. And I shared this view on my Facebook page. The similarity, obviously, there are lots of dissimilarities in terms of historical context, Ecevit's personality, the Republican People's Party in Turkey, and Syriza in Greece. There are a number of dissimilarities, but there is something which is similar between the two phenomena. One is that you raise so much left-wing hopes for economic recovery and political democratization. And you barely come to power. Ecevit too was short of parliamentary majority by a couple of 10 votes, like Syriza being short of 2 or 3 votes. So, in other words, you are in power, but you're not fully grasping power, in a sense. You raise the social hopes, tremendously. Then, what happened in Turkey was that Ecevit, the Republican People's Party, in general, the left in Turkey, because the CHP at the time was something like an umbrella organization which brought together almost all of the left-wing, support of all of the left-wing, groups in Turkey. I myself, as a high school student, was an election observer in one of the right-wing districts of Istanbul at the time. I was 14-year-old, and I had to fight the MHP people to protect the CHP votes at the time. So it was a coalition movement. We came to power, and Ecevit failed miserably. He couldn't deal with the political terrorism, he couldn't deal with economic problems. What followed was that, it was a short minority government of the Justice Party, which they instituted the first neoliberal economic transformation package of Turkey, the third famous January 24 package, and then there was a military coup in 1980. So the danger is that what this tells me is that if left-wing hopes, left-wing expectations are raised tremendously and the promises are not fulfilled, there is a danger that there is going to be a radical right reaction which might be followed by a military or civilian authoritarian regime, which would wipe out the left from the country, which happened in Turkey after the military intervention of 12 September 1980. Obviously, we shouldn't obviously be, extremely pessimistic about it, but there is a danger of raising expectations too much. So perhaps one political lesson is that some degree of moderation is necessary. Some degree of, pulling down the expectations, some degree of realism is necessary for a more feasible, policy environment. That's the only thing that I could draw from this similarity. Because as Kostas was saying, the radical right too were on the rise in the recent elections in Greece. So my fear is that those people who voted for Syriza might very easily change their votes from to something like Golden Dawn in the next elections. Who knows? If their expectations are not fulfilled this time. So there is this danger, and we should keep that in mind when we are looking at Syriza. The other thing is, going back to this neoliberal self of mine, who tells me all the time that you should worship your businessman and not think of any other, alternative. But then again, this businessman hit the ground in the economic crisis of 2009, 2010. There is a play of Bertolt Brecht in which there is a soldier. The soldier, kills so many people, and right to think about the alternative. We should sort of create new institutions, a new line of thinking about economic development, about income distribution, about how to, for example, harmonize economic development and environmental issues, how to harmonize economic development and democracy and human rights and other such stuff. I think that it is time to a little get rid of this neoliberal chevalier in our minds, dictating us that we should continue to worship him. I think that this neoliberal chevalier in our minds has already become a Don Quixote. So therefore, I think it is time to make a new search. What Syriza tells me is this, that we should take it seriously and we should put our minds to a new thinking. This new thinking is not yet apparent, but there are, I think, from all over the world, some serious people who have already been producing some notable works on this. I'm thinking of a person like Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize laureate, chief economist of the IMF, and now a professor of economics at my alma mater, Columbia University. I'm thinking of Daron Acemoğlu, professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I'm thinking of Thomas Piketty, obviously. I'm thinking of a lot of people for, more or less trying to contribute to this new thinking. So, and how to get rid of this, hegemony, and how to build a new economic order. So, I think that, obviously, as you were saying, Dimitri, Greece is small, Syriza is just a, a new party in power. So what should Greece do, in the whole world economy, and what sort of changes that they might bring in? But I think that although that's true, on the other hand, Greece, as far as I know Greece, has a country with great intellectual potential. It has very bright intellectuals. I learned, for example, so much from Greek intellectuals like yourself, and just from a person like Kouranzas, etc. So why not now? Syriza, with its practice and some new thinking, opens a way. Now, I'm not talking about a highway, but at least a path on which we can start thinking about a new alternative. And I think if Syriza combines its efforts with other such efforts in other parts of Europe, in other words, if Syriza manages to somehow Europeanize, its struggle and unites its efforts with some, with similar, movements in southern part of Europe and also in the northern part of Europe, because northern Europe is not without its own problems and issues, we might have at least some sort of, pan-European alternative to the neoliberal Don Quixote. Otherwise, this chevalier is going, in the form of Merkel and others, it's going to dictate our minds for some time to come. So I think it's time to sit down and to use this, this new theoretical accumulation and little practices like Syriza's practices to come up with a new definition of European economic development and income distribution and environmentally sound economic policies. I think in that sense, I think it's a nice intellectual investment. And on my part, I am struggling with my own neoliberal self, and I think that's precisely what I recommend to all of you, that you should sort of question your mind and discover your own, neoliberal inner selves and start a struggle with it. And because, it's time to do it. And if Syriza is successful in Greece, even, to a little extent, that would obviously open the path for the neighboring countries. It's going to create some sort of regional contagion impact. And perhaps we can also benefit from it, theoretically and practically, in Turkey, in our neighboring countries. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Hassan, for a very interesting presentation. Before I give the floor to the audience, everyone is leaving now. What happened? I know. I see some questions, but also I got you. I see 3 hands so far. Wait a second.
Just begun.
I would like to give the floor back to the panelists because they might want to make a couple of remarks to the remarks of others or add new thoughts. A couple of minutes, but I also would like you, each and every one of us, to say what our expectations are. Even though you think will not be a contradiction, what our expectations are, and what we would like them to be. So we'll start with you, Agiris.
Hakan, I wouldn't like to be your therapist. Let us amuse ourselves a little bit. When I first went to England for my MA studies, I went to I will consume my 2 minutes with that, to the British Library to have my card issued, and the lady behind the desk asked me, are you in the sciences or in the arts? Of course I'm in the sciences, I said, but she was not convinced. She said, what do you study? I said, history. This is arts, my friend. So that's how I found out that I'm an artist. And this is what I try to implement, and this is what I teach my students. So I have a problem with the notion of reality. And in historiography, in history teaching, as you know, this is the last resort of anyone who is desperate about using theory or perspective. That's the last resort. This is the reality. And of course, there are different realities. Not only the reality of the numbers, not only the reality of the words, not only the reality of emotions, not only the reality of relations, the reality of fantasies, the reality of double selves. So we need to be, at least take a step back and consider all of these realities together. A short comment about Laclau. When something interesting has happened, I realized, I read it actually somewhere, and I realized that there are a few people in this government, in the Syriza party, who have studied at the University of Essex. That is a surprise to me, because back then, when I myself was at Essex, 94-95, we were 20% of the student population, later on 40%. In the 2000s, Greek students of the student population. It had never occurred to me at that time that one day we will rule this country. And Varoufakis is the Essex PhD, Bruno is the governor for Attiki, is an MA, Essex, I think, government. And there are people in this party, I came to realize, I had no clue, that are quite familiar with Laclau's ideas. Now, what is interesting, there are two interesting points here. First, that there was a time when Greece was ruled by people who had studied at Harvard, right? Now the people who seem to be in power, yet not exactly in power, because they were not able to declare their governmental program so far, have a different kind of education. They have studied, they are not ignorant. They have a different kind of radical, I mean, the same knowledge, but from a very different perspective. So they know the discourse, they know the problems, they know the literature, but they have different perspective. That's one thing. The second thing, and I will conclude with that, is that as far as I know, the left, this radical left, and by the way, the term radical here, because there is a misunderstanding, is not only used in terms of where Syriza stands within the political spectrum in general. It has been used historically against the Communist Party. So this left is not a communist left, it's a radical left, with respect not to the right, but to the left. And this is very important. This is not the extreme left. You can see dozens of accounts describing Syriza as the extreme left, far left. If you see this far left, what then is the Communist Party? So this is a manipulative language. Within this tradition of the European radical left, the intellectual, the mental intellect of many of the people who so far were influential in this party was Boulajas. And Boulajas has said something about what are the limits of democracy and how close democracy is to fascism. And let me remind you that Boulajas committed suicide when PASOK came to govern, right? And this is very telling, and this is a legacy that all of these people, that generation, who lived in Paris back then, Choukalas now is one of the people who are in the parliament, carry. Now, what remains to see within this new conglomeration of ideas, which is very confusing, I agree. There are so many people, PASOK people, older leftist people, new opportunists. I'm very glad to accept all of this, but there is something with regard to ideas again, and I'm sorry that I turned the discussion back to that territory. It will remain to see whether there will be a Boulajas-Laclau reconciliation or a kind of different trends within a party, within a government that follow different traditions. I understand what I'm trying to describe. If you consider that Varoufakis is now considered to be on the right within the Syriza government, and he is a DS expression par excellence, there are others who are on the far left within the Syriza party, and they are Boulajas supporters. Now, if this makes any difference for this discussion, and if Greece, within Greece, or abroad, apart from this populist tradition, the PASOK populist tradition that the left has always struggled against, there are politics that can surface and give us a new vision, then we might probably economize to therapists, which is what most of us are doomed to do these days.
And your prediction? What do you think?
My prediction. Okay. Well, I don't have any prediction, that's my sincere answer, but there is only one thing that I hope for. What I hope is that more and more people will realize that Europe today is not anymore what Europe used to be in the 80s. Of course, Greece is a small country, Greek people is a tiny people, but we are discussing, I mean, the very discussion of what the Greek people is an introvert discussion. We better discuss also what Europe is, what we expect from Europe, what it was in the 80s. Why did they accept this in the first place? That's for me a question that I never managed to fully comprehend, unless it has some political value. It's not only depending on numbers. Okay.
Yeah. Well, my prediction and no prediction. I like very much your point about the intellectual investment. That at least we have an intellectual investment that we should care and give us a platform for thinking. I would like to add something that maybe is not very well known, is that the foreign minister of the present government is a very strong intellectual. And he is somebody who is very closely linked with Turkish politics. So you should watch him, because he is somebody who is first incredibly knowledgeable. Secondly, he knows Turkey very well. as well as other spheres of foreign policy. You have started seeing a different language from Tsipras regarding Greek-Turkish relationships after he visited Cyprus, Greek Cyprus. And I think that's something that may develop into a very interesting dialogue, maybe a beginning of a new era. But certainly he is going to be somebody who is going to be a household name in this country, somebody we should look out for, and I'm sure somebody, I know him personally, somebody who is quite stubborn and quite specific about his ideas. He believes very much in using international law, in applying policies between Turkey and Greece, and he is somebody, of course, who has been involved in the relationship of this country since the earthquake diplomacy era. Nikos Kodias is his name. Look out for him. I'm sure we will hear from him a lot.
Thank you. Let me just go to my bit. One thing to what Hakan said, the problem in Greece is that we have not even gone to the neoliberal phase. It has been hijacked by the vested interests of the big state. And this is also part of why maybe there's nothing wrong with it, maybe we can avoid it. But we have never really gone through it. And so it's interesting in that sense. And also interesting, I was just watching Varoufakis a couple of years ago as a professor. He was being interviewed by another academic, and he was very critical of Piketty. So it's also very interesting.
It was last December.
It was last December, okay. But anyway, my prediction for all I have said, and I think you've heard here among the Greeks at least, different perspectives which represent where the debate stands in Greece today. For albeit all I've said, I think this government is going to last. I think this government has staying power. See, the Syriza government will not go away anytime soon. Now, why do I say this? I believe that it knows, because, I mean, if it sticks to some of its rhetoric and ideology of where it comes from, if it does not succeed, it will give the left a bad name. It has to succeed for itself. Secondly, I think that the government, and I think Tsipras is more of a pragmatist, as I say, it's too early to judge that we take him out to be. Should Tsipras manage somehow to come out with a cohesive rhetoric about what his government should be, it could survive. Unless, of course, public opinion is so much against it because it does not deliver. Not necessarily on its promises. Deliver as what the public expects, on the improvement of everyone's daily life. And I would also hope that at some stage, as it turns towards the center, becomes more pragmatist, it could eventually dump its coalition partner and replace it with another partner, which is also something, because he has shown that the fact that you have this strange coalition is a degree of pragmatism, which many will not understand even within Syriza. But nevertheless, it is a degree of pragmatism, which means that at this stage, a new government comes to power, and there are less things that divide Syriza and Anel, the independent Greeks, on certain issues, than, say, Topodami, which was the other possible coalition partner, would have put many more provisos in the relationship. Anel is there for its political survival, and it's put every one of its party in government. But if it becomes more pragmatist, we might well see a change in a government that might go for 3-4 years. So this is my prediction. Kostas.
Well, with time to repeat it, I love Gramsci, and his notion of hegemony. My IR students can vouch for it. But the reality in Greece is that by all accounts, historical and electoral, Greece has been a center-left country. There were some spells that the right, but in post-74, because before 74, the legacy of the Civil War and it makes things rather different. So there has been no neoliberal hegemony in Greece. very statist, somehow has been more closer in terms of production, in terms of running the economy, has been much more closer to a Soviet-style economy rather than a neoliberal sort of market-oriented economy. That's why, although there is this myth that in Greece we have oligarchs, there are very few, and they are not by any, you don't have the ultra-billionaire people that are running the country, although the single myth is that there are the oligarchs. But anyway, but even those people, yes, have been taken hostage by the state, and of course, as generations pass, they have learned that they to depend on the states for their survival. So the reality is that Greece lacks two things that have prevented, have sort of destroyed our chances to reform ourselves along the European lines, or whatever you want to say. And this is that we didn't have never a majority of liberal political forces or social democratic forces. We are, at least I'm talking about myself, a very small, miserable minority, both liberals and social democrats. Whenever, and we, unfortunately, those people who wanted to express European liberal political practice or European social democratic practice, they were not as strong as they should have been, and they were either eliminated by the electorate, or they had to compromise in order to consolidate their existence within a populist party. So my prediction, first of all, unfortunately, Syriza's argument is weak. In what sense? The background, the philosophical background is that we had an election in Greece. So our platform has been democratically legitimized, and you Europeans cannot ignore what we say. Fine. What this line of reasoning tends to forget is that in other, they are not sort of some technocrats, or that they don't have their own political and democratic legitimacy. Now, at least what I would like to see as an outcome is a government that would last for 4 years, at least 4 years, that will do what I think a patriotic U-turn abroad, and that will succeed in correcting all the shortcomings that we had in Greece so far. The debt is high, yes, 170%. The thing is that most of it is owned by institutional our partners, and servicing that debt is less onerous than its size would suggest, because economists know that the debt's real present value is much lower, and it carries long maturities, and it carries low interest rates. And of course, there has been a promise since November 2012 to extend maturities, to give more gracious periods, so I think that although it is unlikely for Syriza to finance its economic program, if you think that there is also a combined revenue shortfall and a bank deposit overflow, but I think if they get a compromise with our European partners, then they succeeds in correcting tax evasion, go after tax evasion, go after what I call, or Theodore Kourtlis is called the Praetorian politics in Greece, then I think he will dominate Greek politics at least for the next 5 years. The other options we can discuss.
I mean, looking at Greece from outside and learning that Greece has never gone through a neoliberal phase, I mean, on the one hand, again, there is this realist neoliberal in me who tells me that Syriza could stay in power if they become realists, say yes to much of the economic policies coming from the EU, and rectify a few key things at home, raise some of the wages, take a few thousand people to government jobs, appear as if they are fighting corruption, and rectify here, rectify there, and the good old populism, the PASOK of our times. And you stay in power, 4, 5, 10 years, and Tsipras becomes Papandreou as he gets older. So this is what I expect, but this is not what I want. What I want is that, they really, do something new. If they do this, I mean, this is not a word. This is so boring. There is China producing all these things. There is Merkel, and there is Tsipras rapidly becoming a Papandreou, and Greece finally becoming, something. This is. Do we all want to live in this world? I think that we want change, and something new, a new path, a new combination of policies would be good. What I expect from Syriza is that I'm constantly fighting my neoliberal self, and I want them to show me, that they could do something new in Greece, and they might combine their intellectual forces, their political forces, with similar forces in Europe to bring about a non-populist, non-neoliberal new Europe. That's what I want to see in Greece. If that's a utopia, but then again, why not? I think it's worth to invest part of our intellectual energies on this type of new thinking, because otherwise the alternative is the old-fashioned, realism, which I know from the early 1980s onward. It's time to change.
Thank you. Okay, I have quite a few of you with questions. I remember you. I will start with Vachini Nanch.
Well, thank you very much for the discussion. I'll have 2 questions where I would like to answer it. The first one is, to the degree you were able to follow, what did you think about the reactions in Turkey? Any particular comment? And second, to move from the point underlined by Ariana, what would be your projections as to the Turkish-Greek relations? Because we have so far 2 inputs. One was the visit to Greece, but the other one was also the defense minister's action, which was to, commemorate and mark a conflict with Turkey. Thank you.
Okay. Let me take a couple more, and then we'll come to a round. You are next. Here. I'm following.
Thank you. Thank you for your great contributions. I would like to ask about again Greek foreign policy. I had a chance to meet with Professor Kogias. As, let's say, a player background of this Yopos Papandreou's foreign policy. He's an interesting person. I know he's called as the Davutoğlu of Greece. Davutoğlu. Some people call him like that just because he is, in Greece, they are calling him like that because Davutoğlu has an intellectual background, as an international relations scholar. He has some perspectives coming from maybe international relations literature about this change, internationalization of these foreign policies more and more on the base of more global community, promotion of global understandings. So, do you think that CIES can do all these progressive reformist things in Turkish relations despite this coalition? And I would like to ask another thing about political culture, because I know that they couldn't do that during Yorgos Papandreou for ministerial era, just because of this political, let's say, worries coming from this political culture, because it's very easy to provoke some sensitivities in Greek-Turkish relations in Greece. And it sounds very good in Greece when you say something negative about Turkey. If you have an economic crisis, you can very easily raise the tension in Greek-Turkish relations, and it sells. So it's really interesting to ask this question. Is it possible to be successful again in this effort of CIES? This is the second effort, if I am not wrong.
Okay, I'll take one more. I know, it's a gentleman back there. They were here before, they asked me before, and then I'll go to the next round, I'll start with you. Yes, sir.
Okay, I have a very practical, pragmatic question. And that it goes like this. Greece received huge funds in the past, very similar to Portugal, Spain, etc., etc. And, well, I have to say that it's mismanaged, again, like in Portugal or Spain. Now, imagine that I'm a German citizen named Hans, and these funds are collected from the taxes that I paid. So it's my German mark that I paid during the history. Now, my question goes like this. What will Hans think if this debt or a certain amount of this debt will be wiped out? And again, the question goes on like this. What can Merkel do if she wipes out, again, a certain amount of this debt? And what will Portugal or Spain think about it? And they will ask the same thing. So I would like to receive your comments on this. Thank you.
Okay, so, very interesting questions. Who wants to start?
Shall I ask?
Please.
Yeah, you asked me. You know, Nikos, from my impression is that Nikos Kosias is much more organized this time, and is under a different government, of course. Yes. Because we are talking about 1999, we're talking about the PASOK government, and George Papandreou was a foreign minister. Turkey was different, completely different. And now his task will be more difficult, but I think it will be very challenging for him, but I think he has certain ideas. I think he has a much more organized mind. He knows parameters, he knows Turkey, he doesn't know just Turkey, he knows a lot of other countries. He has served as an advisor to foreign minister for 17 years. So he's a very good knowledge of what's happening in the area, in the wider world, and his specific ideas. So I have much more faith in this term of his than I had in the previous term of his. I think his hands are much more loose and much more the area where he can move wider. And I think we will see evidence of that specific policy very soon. That's my impression.
Okay.
Well, the Turkish responses were fully enthusiastic in all parts of the political spectrum, not all of them, of course. I mean, within, broadly speaking, the left. And I published yesterday an article where I argued that that demonstrates a longing for the left in this country and a longing for charming politics as well, because there have been a few comments made by JHP people in particular who said, well, we need a handsome young leader. It won't work like this anymore. Now, there is a lot of romanticization of what it represents. There is a lot of confusion, as you can imagine. You cannot expect from any I hope, any serious political analyst to equate and compare JFA with Syriza. It is ground for this comparison. But somehow everyone is trying to invest politically on this victory. Of course, victory has many parents, and we'll have to see, wait and see in the future whether if a possible failure will totally reverse this fascination. May I also address the question about the German taxpayer? Well, I would say to, what was his name? Hans. No. To first inquire how this money was spent. Because it's not only Hans, there are several taxpayers in Europe who have given their money to Greeks. And apparently there has been a mismanagement. So I would inquire into this mismanagement to their own governments, how their governments accept that this money go this or that direction, because most of the money that have been given in loans actually did not end up in Greek society as large. They ended up in repaying all their loans. That's one thing I would say to Hans. And I would also ask him to ask his grandfather, Johann, let's say, what happened in the 50s when, as we know, after the Second World War, there was a political decision to remove much of the debt that had been accumulated by other German governments in the past, because it was agreed, regardless of the dramatic differences between the two. I'm not arguing that this should happen. I'm not arguing for a haircut, for instance. How continuity was not accepted, continuity between states was not accepted as principles, between administration, were not accepted as principles. But I wouldn't be blunt, and within, as far as I can see, because I have friends there, within this public opinion, the German public opinion, it doesn't look nice to give money to a state, to a society that apparently has been proven unworthy of that. Now, the last question I think Hans should ask is, if Greece is kicked off the Eurozone, or even the European Union, would that be better for Germany or not?
If I may just tackle the other two speakers too. Regarding the Hans question, I mean, I have a different perspective, and I think it sort of touches upon what Kostas said. It has to do with democratic legitimacy. And this is what, these arguments are fine as to responsibility and the past, but the fact is that the money Greece gets from all the creditor nations are also approved by their parliaments. And would their parliaments ever decide to write off Greek debt? I very much doubt it. And I think this is the issue at hand right now, and I think even this government over the last week has changed position on this, at least in its negotiating time. It's not acting for debt write-off anymore, it's asking for some perpetual sort of bonds, because it knows that it will face up the challenge in national parliaments. So that perpetual bonds, in the sense that ultimately Greece will pay off its interests over the long term, but not necessarily the debt. But how can you go and ask the fathers and mothers of a nation, parliament, to write off money that they have given? I see a fundamental issue there. So this is one thing. The foreign policy question is very important, because I take a slightly different perspective. First of all, I do not think that Syriza to now, and even judging from Tsipras' visit to Cyprus, is any different than what previous Greek governments have. I think Tsipras was very conservative in his statements. I think he said the same thing as someone else would have said. Whether it comes to Greek-Turkish relations, whether it comes to a solution to the Cyprus question, whether it comes to asking, the Barbaros to leave Cyprus exclusive economic zone. I don't think he said anything vastly different from what previous governments have done. The one difference had to do with his visit with Turkish civil society representatives. But, this is something to be considered, and I'm not sure Ankara is necessarily happy with that also, but we shall see what this means. We should not also forget there is an economic element tied to it. I mean, the industry in Greece is tourism, and everyone waits for the 4, 5, 6 months where the tourists flood Greece, and the country needs the revenue. And part of those tourists are the Turks that come more and more. And I don't think you necessarily want to spoil that relationship. So we have to keep that in mind. And so in that sense, Kamenos and his purported positions, I think we should see more what Tsipras is doing as Prime Minister. That's what I'm saying. I see him as a pragmatist trying to tie in the government together. Even though he will have a problem with Kamenos, and as I said, coalitions could change over time. Now, regarding Kodias, it's very interesting. I have my doubts. And I have my doubts, in what sense? Yes, this Davutoglu comparison is there because it's an academic who's become a practitioner. On the other hand, my reading of what Kodias has written over time is to develop some sort of, just like Davutoglu has his neo-Ottoman sort of tradition. And there's a counterpart in Russia called Dugin with neo-Eurasianism. What Kodias is talking about is some sort of new Hellenism. And the problem with this new Hellenism is what I said before about marginalization. A marginalized country that risks becoming even more marginalized comes up with a new discourse to justify its marginalization. And when you do this, you forget that in parallel with your history and the evolution of your history, you also belong to something called Europe. And that's part of you too. And by developing this model, you're forgetting the European part, which links you to the rest of the world. Which links you to the world that even Hakan talks about, that ultimately you could bring about thinking and new ideas. And I have a feeling Kodias is not totally, in many of his writings, in some of his sayings, is not necessarily very clear. Being an advisor to Papandreou does not mean anything. Papandreou had tons of advisors, and not all of them agreed with Papandreou's vision. Actually, I think Papandreou is much more forward-looking in many things than any of his advisors were. We know of advisors that have nothing, do not see eye to eye with Papandreou on anything. Other IR professors, especially another one from Piraeus, where Kodias is from. But that's my problem with Kodias right now. We have to see what his vision of a new Greece actually is. Because my feeling is, when you start detaching this from what is also part of you, the European context, the Western context, then you might have a problem in the making. But, it's still too early to say. And it's also, as I said, very much dependent on what the Prime Minister sets as a goal. Because Kodias, on the other hand, we all know, is not elected. So maybe that's one way for Tsipras to keep him under wraps. Much more easier than maybe an elected parliamentarian. But that's my reading. We shall see where we go with this. Kostas?
Let me start with Minister Kodias, who is a good friend of mine. Kodias came to academia late. All his life has been a very shrewd and successful political operative. So I think any comparison with Davutoglu, I don't know. But it's the first time that Kodias is out there, visible. So this is extremely important. Now, bear in mind that during a very polarized, very ugly, bloodthirsty electoral campaign, foreign policy was not an issue. Not even once. Never. There were these Kamenos, comments that the national pride and whatever. You know what Kamenos means? Bird. The other thing about the debts, please. I would have been much happier if the government's spearhead was the economy and not the debt. I think the government has already found itself entrapped in that argument that won them the election. That if we succeed in write off the debt, then things will get better, then the international financial markets will be open and we'll be able to finance our program of... so I think this has been a strategic mistake, focusing on the debt, on something that they cannot get. This is... now, the other thing about Hans, I mean, you know, forget about the legitimacy of taxpayers, German taxpayers or Italian taxpayers. I've already referred to that you know, Merkel and the rest, they've got the same democratic legitimacy as our government back home. The thing is, and this is what makes Europeans unpredictable at this time, is that there has been a 240 billion euros bailout. The Greek economy started sort of standing on its own, and now we ask for more, because that's what we're asking. You know, if you write off the debt that a state holds, it means that that state has to write, to register that haircut in their own budgets. And this is a political problem, it's not an economic problem. I think that it's not just the taxpayers' money. It's for me, it's immoral, it's unethical to ask for more.
What we heard all through this economic crisis was a certain revitalization of this North-South distinction in Europe, where the North has regained its pride, the Protestant North, as the cradle of sound economic policies, and the Hans, obviously, is the symbol of this. And the Southerners are basically a bunch of losers. You know, they are Catholic or Orthodox, belonging to the wrong religion, and lazy, and overspending, aging, and basically they are greedy for tourism. They should sell their islands, and they have some great past in the distant past, Aristotle and Plato, but now they are a bunch of Manuels and Yorgos and Portuguese name that they couldn't pronounce. And they should basically submit themselves to the Northern Will and correct themselves. Isn't this the lesson? I mean, that's psychologically how I am reading this whole thing. That forget about yourself, you are nothing, you don't have any values. Submit yourself to my will, and I'm going to save you. Just be patient for 25 more years, and do what I tell you to do, because you owe us too much. Don't ask for more money, and all these things, Vangeli, that you were like us in the 1950s. No one would remember that. And basically, I think behind all this economic give and take, there is also this ideological, new Orientalist, North-South distinction, and which is obviously playing very hard on the psyches of the people, particularly in the South. Romanians, losers. Spanish people, losers. Greeks, losers. Portuguese, losers. French, becoming losers. The Brits are a little... So I think we cannot survive in this ideological land. That's what I'm saying. This is not a sustainable ideological climate. The Muslims, terrorists, Southerners, losers, Turks are this and that. This type of supremacist arguments are not good for any economic recovery. If there is an ideological mistake, Costa, us, there must be mistakes at the economic policy level. I mean, there is something wrong with this, so we have to address this, and we cannot, I mean, as a Turk, I wouldn't want to survive in an EU where I am put down all the time as the loser, the lazy, the one who doesn't, corrupt and eats all the money whenever, Hans gives them the money. I mean, this type of portrayal is something that we should change. I mean, and we cannot see ourselves in the mirror of the Lord all the time. This type of mirroring is wrong. And I think we should change that mirroring. That's the first thing because as Turkish people, we have been mirrored so much like this. You are the losers, you are the barbarians, you cannot do anything, or you are responsible for all the crimes in history, and this and that. So this type of mirroring now has an impact on Greece, and I think that it's not a sustainable, psycho-ideological environment. That's the first thing. The second small point is that since our own little recent history, I started to become extremely scared of academics turning foreign ministers. I think that, any type of neo-something ideology, neo-Turkism, Ottomanism, Hellenism, Eurasianism, you name it, I think they are very dangerous. And I think that politicians, for all practical purposes, should become honest people with very few ideas. I think they should consult other people. They should be in touch with reality, with people on the ground. But politicians with theories of their own are the most dangerous creatures in this world. So therefore, an economics minister, for example, should be someone with some, nice ideas about the economy, but not a professional economist. So therefore, if this guy has these ideas about new Hellenism, you should be very careful about it. That's what I would say about it.
Yeah, the second round, you. I think we have 3 hands, so.
I would like to say thank you. I was wondering what the youth thinks of the results, and if they are actually quite hopeful too. Are they more how, I don't know, after Obama won in America and he had all these social welfare for the youth and healthcare, this and that, or are they more like the French youth, which is kind of fed up with having a 25% youth unemployment rate? Are Greek young people looking to stay in Greece, or are they looking for opportunities elsewhere?
Okay.
Thank you. I want to learn your thoughts about the strange coalition with Syriza and independent Greeks. So I believe in the good intentions of Syriza, but I'm suspicious about their capacity in general. So they had to make a coalition with independent Greeks just for 2 seats in the parliament. So maybe independent Greeks took only 1 ministry from Syriza, but it's very strategic actually, a Ministry of Defense. And in Turkish we have an expression, maybe a fly is very small, but it makes you nauseous. So maybe independent Greeks is very, very small in the parliament, but they can jeopardize the good intentions of Syriza. What do you think about that?
Okay. Gentleman there, and then we'll go to Laura and Mustafa.
Hello. I was in Greece on last December with an invitation of my Greek friends, and I visited Thessaloniki and Kozani. While we were having some Greek coffee in a cafe, something that I heard from them, from my Greek friends, really shocked me. They told me that Germans and Merkel constantly come back again, they invade again, and Europe will not be able to, save Greece. And I was really shocked. Are you kidding me? I responded quickly. And now it seems neither European Union and nor the new government has an intention for Brexit. You all must learn the term. But it is on the table, the Brexit. So I would like to learn what does Greek society think about the political, not economic, but political consequences of a Brexit? How would Greece place itself on the international politics?
And last one, Laura. Who's Portuguese, by the way? Portuguese.
Yes, I wanted to add a Portuguese perspective to this discussion. Well, first of all, a lot of what I heard about Greece and about the economy in Greece is parallel to Portugal. Like the things you talked about here about neoliberal policies never being implemented in the country completely, fully, it's the same in Portugal. And the state taking all of that resources up to the state. So I don't think Greece feels marginalized, but the same happens in Portugal. People also feel marginalized there. And they're actually looking at Greece to see what's going to happen next and maybe take an example from Greece. So not only Greece, but Spain. So I think it will have implications for the European Union as a whole, and to see in which direction is the European Union going. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, last one, and then we'll just go back eating, and that's it. And then...
Hello. My question would again center around foreign policy, and it would concentrate on Greece's rapprochement with Russia and how it impacts with relations with the European Union, if you would comment on that.
All right.
Russia is always somehow is very much linked to Greece historically. And in moments of crisis and in moments of difficulty, you will find lots of Greece thinking, hoping that Russia would come to their help. In the back of their mind subconsciously, but sometimes they're talking about that, they would very much have liked Russia at this moment to give them 10 billion and everything is forgotten. So a lot of Greeks, Russia is a benevolent giant, thinking about the past and thinking about their religious, of course, background. So if for example, Putin woke up tomorrow and said, okay, I'm going to help Greeks. Actually, they said a little bit like this, we are here if you need something. But nobody has required any help from us. That's what Russia said. I think it would be quite welcome. We are not going to accept that, but I'm talking about the public opinion is, is looking quite favorably about that. And they were they were not all in the same line as the Europeans with regards to Ukraine. That was your question.
Let me address the independent Greeks question. The other use of the term radical, which is actually the fundamental use of the term radical, is going back to the roots. And before the elections, the good old Marxists in that party, actually good old Leninists, made a very basic calculation. And they said one of the main analytical tools within Leninism is that there are differences, the primary difference and the secondary difference. So according to the primary difference logic, what now counts is finding a kind of common ground for the debt and economy. And this distinguishes us from others. Whereas the secondary difference within this atmosphere might relate to national issues, issues of security, etc. So it was interesting to see, and this I'm not saying, I'm not making this observation just to justify it, not at all. That there is an amount of pragmatism, as Dimitri said before, that interestingly brings us back to Lenin. Because you need to somehow invest your policies, and this has been the case before. I mean, these are choices that are reminiscent of the PASOK populism, by the way. So although there are many of us who are very unhappy with this choice, there is a rationale, actually even ideological justification in this search for whoever accepts the Leninist tradition.
I want to say also something about the youth question. Not that we are young. We are young, but you know.
We are young.
Well,
Mike, please.
yeah. There's not much to say. Actually, there are no numbers because Greek young qualified people, they have, as they have always done in the past, migrated to Western Europe. And because the European Union is without frontiers, there is no way to know. Certainly, there is no doubt that the rate of people migrating and talented people migrating is far higher than in the past. Would I call it a brain drain? No. No. Because there is, fortunately, there is an abundance of qualified people in Greece. So we will not, this migration, fortunately, thank God, will not have the same effect that had in Eastern European democracies after the fall of socialism. But it's something you should remember, and you should know, especially in Turkey, that like Turks, Greeks are diaspora people. So they like to move. It's not pleasant to have people migrating to qualified people, but I wouldn't call it a brain drain. But this is an estimate. I don't have the now. What my problem with, and I would like to stress that my problem with the coalition government is that I can understand the political